All right, Ryan, what is on your radar?
Well, in France, one of the traffic laws on the books requires motorists to always have a yellow vest with them so that if they get a flat tire or have an emergency, they're visible to other drivers. It's one of those perfectly sensible laws European countries have that everybody follows because why not? So in the fall of 2018, the French government, under Emmanuel Macron, tried to do something else it also thought was perfectly sensible. The planet is warming in dangerous ways, and fossil fuels are the primary cause. It's particularly bad for France as the grape harvest is being tortured by hotter weather, and if the Gulf Stream collapses, Europe, which is much higher north on the map than people realize, could become downright frigid. And so Macron instituted a gas tax. It was shared sacrifice, he said, and it was for the good of everybody. Higher gas prices would encourage people to move toward electric vehicles, hybrids, more efficient cars, or push them to drive less. The price signal would inspire the market to shift off of fossil fuels and more toward clean energy. It all made perfect sense, except to the people who were being asked to bear the brunt of it. Protests started small and slowly grew. And on November 17th, people angry about the gas tax blocked traffic throughout Paris, donning the yellow vests that were in their cars. The media was confused at first at what to make of these protests. These were regular, working-class people protesting to improve their material economic circumstances. The word for that has always been left-wing. Yet these people were protesting a law aimed at climate change, and they didn't seem much versed in their Foucault. So could they really be left-wing? Eventually, the media slotted them into the populist right, lumping them in with supporters of the Trump campaign and of Brexit. Canada had its own attempt at a copycat Yellow Vest protest movement led by truckers there, but it fizzled out quickly before it left a mark. This time, the truckers are back, and this time they've definitely left a mark. So after the Yellow Vest protests, liberal governments learned a very narrow lesson. Don't do a carbon tax unless somehow you're making it up to working people so they don't pay anything extra. That lesson translated to Biden's Build Back Better Act, and it made it heavy on investments in clean energy rather than policies that would purposely raise gas prices. But the lesson elites drew from Paris was way too narrow. The real lesson is that people have been so driven into the ground by 40 years of neoliberalism and austerity, a system that smashes communities into little individual pieces, that they're simply not willing to take any more crap for any reason. So during the pandemic, instead of calibrating restrictions with a cost-benefit analysis, many governments went as far as they thought they could take it and were enthusiastically cheered on by many of the upper and upper middle class people who form the backbone of center-left coalitions around the world. So this anti-mandate trucker protest is the backlash. The media has zeroed in on the white supremacists who have inserted themselves into it, but taking a closer look at public opinion toward it should be sobering for the left. A recent Ipsos poll put two options before people. One was, quote, "I may not agree with everything the people who have taken part in the truck protests in Ottawa have said, but their frustration is legitimate and worthy of our sympathy." And the other was, "What the people taking part in the truck protests in Ottawa have said and done is wrong and does not deserve any of our sympathy." So what the poll does is take out somebody's opinion on the tactic of shutting down Ottawa or shutting down the Ambassador Bridge and asks directly about the grievances. Now, overall, 54% of Canadians said the protesters do not deserve any of our sympathy. Now, that might be a comforting number for Canadian progressives, but the trouble lies deeper in the numbers. So for people 55 and up, only 37 sympathized with the protesters, 37%. But among people 18 to 34, that number was 61%. Meanwhile, people who made less than $40,000 a year were supportive of the protesters, 54 to 46%, which is a 16-point swing relative to the overall population. People who make over $100,000 a year are the least supportive in the polls. Ipsos also asked whether people agree with the statement, quote, "The truck protest is mostly economically disadvantaged Canadians letting governments know that they are struggling." 51% of people making less than $40,000 a year agreed with that statement. For those making more than $100,000, only 32% agreed with that. Now, who would you say is more plugged into the feelings of working class Canadians? Those making less than $40,000 a year or those making more than $100,000 a year? So Ipsos then asked those same folks if they support the Black Lives Matter movement. Overall, Canadians support BLM by a 68-32 margin. Among Gen Z, the support was 86%, which is practically universal. Among 18 to 34-year-olds, it was 77%. Now, they don't offer economic crosstabs for this one, but they do have a category for people with only a high school degree, and among those, support for Black Lives Matter is put at 64%. Now, of course, no poll is perfect and none of this is precise, but the general picture is clear. The people in Canada most likely to sympathize with the truckers are young working-class people, and most of those people also support Black Lives Matter. This is a frustrated group of people who are up for grabs politically. If progressives simply write them off as right-wing reactionaries, the right wing is all too happy to tell them that, yes, that's exactly what they are, and welcome them in. So Emma Jackson, a lefty writing in the Canadian publication The Breach, has grasped this intuitively, and she has a new piece reaching out to her comrades, urging them to take what's going on seriously. If the left is being out-organized by the right among the working class, it's not the left anymore. So Jackson writes, quote, what we're currently witnessing is a troubling sign that COVID-19 could become a generational defining moment of politicization for the right, radicalizing tens of thousands who are disaffected by the system and directing them straight into the welcoming arms of the far right. Instead of building an insular movement restricted to people who agree with each other 93% of the time, she writes, the right has successfully tapped into widely held resentment and built a mass on-ramp for people with highly divergent views. It's why the Freedom Convoy isn't just being ardently defended by white supremacists on Rebel News, but also by anti-vaccine Green Party supporters in the inboxes of mainstream environmental organizations. She goes on. Perhaps the most troubling response has been the speed at which people have unfriended, unfollowed, or blocked their friends and family who have expressed even the shallowest support for the convoy. While people are under absolutely no obligation to be on the receiving end of hate and vitriol, we're never going to out-organize the far right by cutting ourselves off from the same social base they're actively recruiting from. She concludes like this. Labor's institutional heft is unparalleled, but those of us belonging to other movement threads, climate justice, anti-racism, indigenous solidarity, must also reflect on how it is that the far right is doing a better job of recruiting our own family, friends, and coworkers into their movements than we are into our own. And so, Kim, I think this Canadian writer makes a very interesting point, and at the end, I thought she hit it well in the sense that you're even losing your own friends and family. Like, so yeah. If that's the case, like there needs to be some serious self-reflection about the state of the movement.
Yeah, well, I mean, and a lot of us thought that self-reflection would happen after 2016, but instead, I've just seen it get worse, instead of getting better. But, the point, I think that there's a great point there that the left is losing people. The left is losing the working class. The working class is becoming increasingly more embraced by the right. And I would say that it's not so much that the right is able to recruit people or on-ramp them. What I would dispute on that is I think it's more about who's willing to cover and embrace these certain movements as they organically rise up. So we've seen, with Yellow Vests, for example, in France, that when that movement was rising up, a lot of left-wing outlets, news outlets, and then it was on social media as well in left-wing circles, would demonize it, whereas people on the right would say, hey, maybe these people actually have a grievance. So I don't know if it's that people are just being recruited over to the right and because the left is ignoring them. I think it's the left is ignoring the grievances of these people, inevitably allowing them to be embraced by more right-wing outlets. And look, as somebody who's been in this position as a populist leftist for the last few years, is that, anytime I disagree with somebody on the left about something, I'm now considered a right-winger or even a racist. And that is that's the biggest problem I think the left has, is anybody they don't agree with is just on anything is suddenly a right-winger and suddenly a racist. And they don't even want to hear the grievance. They don't want to even participate or platform it or even give it coverage, right? So I think the biggest thing the left needs to do if they want to start really, truly re-engaging with these workers that are expressing various grievances, which you very well pointed out, is drop that hostility. you're losing friends and family and defriending them because because suddenly you think if they support truckers, they're racist. Suddenly you think if they're anti-mandate, they're racist. Suddenly you think if they're for the yellow vest, they're racist. They don't want the gas tax. It's so dropping that, I think, and saying, look, let me hear you for what you are and what your grievance is, rather than just labeling this automatically as white supremacist, I think would be the biggest first step.
Yeah.
It's funny that what you hear so often in the media is that the right, broadly defined, is getting more extreme all the time, has moved further right, which always then confuses people. But then why is the right doing so well? If it's getting so extreme, it's outside the bounds of what normal people would support, why is it successful? And the answer is that it's not, like, the conservative movement is not getting more extreme. On a lot of issues, it's actually moderated. On fundamental economic issues, the U.S. right, Trump is temperamentally extreme, but he was more moderate than Paul Ryan on a host of economic issues. He was more moderate than the people he was running against. Meanwhile, the Democratic side, the progressive side, has gotten, I think, much more extreme on cultural issues, social cultural issues, the tendency, like you just described, Kim, to treat everyone who is out of step with you or is not yet in step with you as a racist is this very alienating, extreme worldview. It's the kind of issues that animate the people who lead progressive vanguards in the media and in politics. And so you have this situation where, no, it's not what you're being told. In many ways, the right is less extreme. Now, again, not temperamentally. Many of its figures are, kind of sound crazy a lot of the time, but in what its views are, and the left is the opposite, and the results have been really bad for progressives.
Yeah, and I think the elevation of those social issues to a place where if you don't get, as Emma said, 93% conformity, it's maybe 99 or 100% conformity in some circles. If you don't get that level of conformity, then you can't talk about anything else. Everything else is cut off. So you then literally can't cover, just in a neutral way, the trucker protests, because there are some elements of the trucker protests that are in complete conflict and tension with your social justice values and your social values. And so then there's this massive vacuum. You have millions of people who are curious about it. And like Emma says, so then Rebel News just starts live streaming it and just playing it straight. And so as a result, Rebel News is then going to pick up tons of new viewers, which they're going to then channel into what I would call an extremely toxic direction. But it's not because people sought out that type of far right-wing politics. It's because they just went looking for coverage of the trucker protests, and they were the only ones, really covering it seriously. And so there they are. If the left was in there, just doing neutral coverage, but then pushing them toward saying, your grievances are with Trudeau. We agree with you, and that's one point Emma makes. The right and the significant, the left in Canada all hate Trudeau, but for different reasons, but for similar reasons in the same way. And if you can find that level of common ground, then you can actually grow your coalition to a place where it could actually start making decisions and actually governing. Otherwise, you're just shouting at each other over a barricade.
Well, you make a really great point on that. I think, Ryan, that, just in my own anecdotal world, I used to watch Rachel Maddow every day. Every single day I watch Rachel Maddow. And then I stopped enjoying her show as much. And I've always sampled all the shows every single day and try to watch all the networks. But now I watch Tucker every day. And Tucker was somebody, I hated Tucker. I mean, it was like Tucker and Mitch McConnell were the two people I couldn't stand more than anybody. But then when I would tune into, I couldn't believe my ears with Tucker Carlson. I had the same experience with Glenn Beck, where suddenly they were agreeing with a lot of these more populist ideas that I myself was in agreement with, and I couldn't believe it. And then that was the only show that I could listen to that actually gave favorable coverage to something I was in agreement to, whereas I would turn on other news and it would be something else. So I think what happens, to your point, is that then people tune into these shows, right? Because they agree with XYZ, but then maybe they don't agree with ABC, but it doesn't matter. They're still watching, and then they kind of get, in some ways, indoctrinated, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. So then you hear and you say, well, I agreed with them on this, so maybe I'll agree with them on that. And then they, of course, do inevitably make some good points on ABC. And then you think, okay, well, maybe I kind of agree with them a little bit more on that as well. And it does.
Right, because they have a captive audience then. Right,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
captive,
at that point, yeah.
And they can kind of shape the arguments that you're hearing, and you're like, oh, yeah, their argument does sound better.
Yeah,
well,
I
right,
still
they
do watch
the
Rachel.
other side of it, too. Right.
Yeah, I watch both of them every day, but I don't agree with Rachel as much. Now I listen to her and I'm like,
I used to watch CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, and like all night, and just go back and forth between them. And actually now I can't stand any of them. It feels so irrelevant what they're. I mean, it's as CNN is getting the war it has desperately wanted right now, and what MSNBC was covering was like, it's terrible. And yeah, so anyway,
it's a good point. It's a really good point. So.
It's hard to watch. So we hope people watch us instead.
There you
go.
Yes. Anyway, looking forward to your radar up next.